second part of our archaeology series. So in our last presentation, we looked at the kingdom of Assyria, and in particular, its conquest on a Judean site called LACHISH. Now, I wasn't going to do this, but last week, after the presentation, I was talking with Eva, and we both decided it would be good to have a short quiz. So I'm going to see how much you all remember from last week's presentation. I have 5 questions, and I know not all of you were here last week, but it's multiple choice, so you have a 1 in 4 chance of getting the answer right. Okay, right. Recap quiz. So, question 1. Which Assyrian king besieged the city of Lachish? Was it A. Shalmaneser III, B. Tiglath-Pileser, C. Sennacherib, or D. Wait until I've given all the answers, please. Or D. Ashurbanipal. Okay, this is how we're going to do it. I'm going to say A, B, C, or D, and you raise your hand if you think that's the answer. So, raise your hand if you think it was A. No one. Okay. B. C. D. Okay, the answer is C, Sennacherib. Well done. So, question 2. In which city was Sennacherib's palace located? Was it A. Nimrud, B. Nineveh, C. Khorsabad, or D. Sumer? Put your hand up if you think it was A, B, C, D. Okay, a few people were a bit hesitant this time. The correct answer is B. It was Nineveh. Okay. Question 3. Which of the following artifacts were found at Lachish? A. Arrowheads, B. Armor, C. Slingstones, or D. All of the above? A, B, C, D. The correct answer is D, all of the above. Question 4. What was the name of the artifact that recorded Sennacherib's campaigns? Was it A, the Taylor Prism, B, the Sumerian King List, C, the Meneptah Stela, or D, the Enuma Elish Tablet? Who says A? Who says B? C? D? The correct answer is A, the Taylor Prism. Okay. Last question. Are you ready? Question 5. Which book of the Bible is Lachish not mentioned in? Is it A, Joshua, B, Psalms, C, Isaiah, or D, Jeremiah? Put your hand up if you think it's A, B, C, D. The correct answer is B, Psalms. Okay. Well done, guys. I am glad to see that you were listening. Now, as we mentioned last week, Assyria was a very prominent empire. But there was another powerful empire that had a significant impact on the Israelites. It's mentioned several times in the Bible, and it is, of course, the ancient Babylonian Empire. Babylon was located in Lower Mesopotamia. So, like Assyria, it was in modern-day Iraq. The river Euphrates actually runs right through the city, and the Babylonians made use of the river by irrigating their land. You can't really tell today, but for most of ancient history, right through to the Roman times, it was one of the most fertile places in the ancient Near East. It also had a very long history, which is divided up by scholars into different time periods: Old Babylonian, Kassite, Middle Babylonian, Assyrian, and Neo-Babylonian. But the peak of its strength happened during the Neo-Babylonian period. Neo is just a word which means new. And that's the period we're particularly interested in, because it's during this time that Babylon was ruled by a king called Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Babylon was briefly excavated a number of times. In fact, Austin Henry Layard, who we talked about last week, made a short visit there in 1850. But it wasn't until 1899 that significant excavations were carried out by a German team under the direction of this man, Robert Koldewey. The excavations lasted over 15 years, and even though they only excavated parts of the city, their work has helped us appreciate how massive this ancient city was. It's been estimated that Babylon was the largest city in the ancient world. You can see a plan of Babylon on the right. It actually had 8 gates, which is extremely rare because gates were the weakest points of the city when it was being attacked. So usually cities would just have 1 or 2 gates, but Babylon had 8. You can also see in the plan the river Euphrates running through the middle. On the right, you have a temple complex. So here was the temple of Marduk, the main Babylonian deity, and you also had the ziggurat next to it. The whole city was surrounded by huge double walls made of mud brick. These walls are described by a number of different classical authors. For example, here's one description by a Roman historian called Quintus Curtius Rufus. He says, "Its wall is constructed of small baked bricks and is cemented together with bitumen. The wall is 10 meters wide, and it is said that 2 chariots meeting on it can safely pass each other. Its height is 25 meters, and its towers stand 3 meters higher again." Herodotus writes about the extent of Babylon in a similar way, and we also have the description by the excavator of Babylon, Robert Koldewey. In the introduction of his book, Excavations at Babylon, he writes this: "It is most desirable, if not absolutely necessary, that the excavation of Babylon should be completed. Up to the present time, only about half the work has been accomplished, although since it began we have worked daily, both summer and winter, with from 200 to 250 workmen. This is easily comprehensible when we consider the magnitude of the undertaking. The city walls, for instance, which in other ancient towns measure 3 meters, or at the most 6 or 7 meters, in Babylon are fully 17 to 22 meters thick. On many ancient sites, the mounds piled above the remains are not more than 2 or 3 to 6 meters high, while here we have to deal with 12 to 24 meters, and the vast extent of the area that was once inhabited is reflected in the grand scale of the ruins. Even the excavator admits that this city was enormous." This is an artist's reconstruction of Babylon. In particular, you can see the ziggurat in the middle. And this, along with the temple, was dedicated to the god Marduk. It would have been made of mud bricks, and apparently the bricks were of such good quality that in the 1880s, the local villagers dug out the ancient bricks and reused them as building material. So unfortunately, we don't actually have any of the structure left today, only the foundation ditches remain. But in 2011, in a private collection called the Skoyen collection, scholars discovered the oldest known representation of the Babylonian ziggurat. Here it is. It's a little bit worn, so it's difficult to see clearly, but here's a drawing of it. So on the left of the image, you have a depiction of the ziggurat. Just above it, you have it in plan view, and on the right, you have a depiction of a king. Now, traditionally, the Tower of Babel is thought to have been erected in Babylon, and many have thought it could have been a ziggurat. So perhaps for this reason, this stele has now become known as the Tower of Babel stele. But this artifact actually dates to the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, which means that the king on the right is almost certainly a depiction of Nebuchadnezzar himself. Which is very exciting, as it's only one of 4 definite depictions of Nebuchadnezzar ever discovered. Here we have an artist's reconstruction of one of the most famous gates of Babylon. Does anyone know what this gate is? Ashley, put your hand down. Yes, it is the Ishtar gate, Ishtar being one of the Babylonian goddesses. You can kind of get an idea of how massive this gate would have been. And if you look closely, you can see all along the walls are these defensive towers. It's been estimated that there were around 250 of them. And leading up to the Ishtar gate, you have this long road called the Processional Way. Here's a section of the Processional Way, which is actually in the British Museum. But if you want to see the whole of the Ishtar Gate, then you'll need to book a flight to Germany, because it's been reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. The gate was decorated with images of dragons and bulls, and the processional way was lined with 120 images of lions like this one. And that's quite interesting because it reminds us of a passage in Daniel chapter 7. In this chapter, God gives Daniel a prophetic dream outlining through symbols the succession of different world empires. And in verse 4, he sees the first kingdom of Babylon, and the symbol used to represent Babylon is a lion with eagle's wings. And so it's very interesting that this symbol is used because, as we've seen, lions feature prominently in Babylon. They were also the king of the beasts, and you can really see the connection between the Bible and the history of this ancient city. This is the Ishtar Gate, now in the Berlin Museum. The bricks were glazed with this striking blue colour, and you can see when you contrast it with the people just how imposing this gate would have been. I remember last year I was in the car with my brother Ashley, and we were driving to Wolverhampton. And we drove through the Rotherhithe Tunnel. So this tunnel was created in the early 20th century. But as we drove through it, we saw that they'd created it using glazed brick. So the light from the cars was bouncing off the walls and creating this amazing shimmering effect. Now, these walls were just grey, but both Ashley and I were still very impressed. And it made me think how much more magnificent this gate would have been with the beautiful colours shimmering and reflecting in the sunlight. Clearly, Nebuchadnezzar wanted to emphasize his strength and power by building this gate and processional way. Now, bear in mind, it wasn't usual for cities to have something like this. So imagine what it would have been like if you were someone like Daniel or his friends. You've come from a comparatively small city, you've been taken captive from your homeland, and now, as you're walking up to Babylon, this is what you see. Half of you, I'm sure, is scared by how powerful this empire is, but the other half of you is probably quite impressed by the beauty and the grandness of this place. Because remember, part of the aim of the king was that he wanted people he'd deported to become loyal subjects, to become part of his great Babylonian empire. It's amazing when you look at this to think that these bricks are still so beautiful 2,600 years after they were first created. You also understand just how enormous the Ishtar Gate was when you realise that the part of the gate that's on display today is just the smaller frontal part. The larger part is actually too big to fit into the museum, and so it's still in storage. Babylon is also famous for the Hanging Gardens. Apparently, they were one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It's said that Nebuchadnezzar created them for his Persian queen who missed the mountains and the plants that she had at home, and so the king created a garden for her. We don't actually have any archaeological evidence for the gardens, but we do have some descriptions from classical authors and historians. Quintus Curtius Rufus, for example, describes it this way. On its summit are the Hanging Gardens, a wonder celebrated by the fables of the Greeks. They are as high as the top of the walls, and owe their charm to the shade of many trees. The columns supporting the whole edifice are built of rock, and on top of them is a flat surface of squared stones, strong enough to bear the deep layer of earth placed upon it and the water used for irrigating it. Even though we haven't found any archaeological evidence in Babylon for the garden, there has been some evidence of this kind of garden at Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh. So some scholars, such as Stephanie Daly, now think the legendary Hanging Gardens were actually in Assyria, while others still believe that they could have been built at Babylon and the archaeological evidence has been destroyed or perhaps not yet discovered. But what is evident is that Babylon was a beautiful city. So much so, in fact, that towards the end of his life, Alexander the Great actually resided there, and he ended up dying in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. While Robert Caldervot's excavations didn't find evidence of a garden, they did find thousands of these. These are mud bricks which were actually stamped with the name of Nebuchadnezzar in cuneiform writing. This is what it says. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who provides for Esagila and Azida, the eldest son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, am I. There are literally thousands of these bricks, and again you can see some of them in the British Museum. So Nebuchadnezzar was very proud of his building achievements. He actually records his building projects on clay cylinders that were deliberately buried in the foundations of his structures. This is just one of several that describe his building projects. This example includes details of him restoring temples and ziggurats. It states that he repaired and also extended his father's palace that had been damaged by flooding. It also describes how he built a new fortress on the north side of the city. All this helps us to understand a statement that is made in the book of Daniel chapter 4. The Babylonian king is walking around the royal palace, looking at the city. And in verse 30, he says this, Is this not great Babylon that I have built, for a royal dwelling by my mighty power, and for the honor of my majesty? And for a long time before the excavations of Babylon, this verse had puzzled scholars. Because, as we'd mentioned earlier, Babylon had a long history. It had existed long before Nebuchadnezzar was even born. But after the excavations, this statement made a lot more sense. Now we understand just how much work Nebuchadnezzar had done to build and renovate Babylon, and we can understand why he'd become so proud of his achievements in Daniel chapter 4, especially considering that the greatest period of Babylonian history was actually under his reign. But Nebuchadnezzar isn't just famous for his building projects. He's famous for his military campaigns as well, in particular, his invasion to Judah. This small clay tablet, known as the Jerusalem Chronicle or the Nebuchadnezzar Chronicle, is currently housed in the British Museum. It's a description of Nebuchadnezzar's military campaigns, and it actually references the first campaign against Jerusalem in 597 BC, and it also refers to King Jehoiachin's deportation. This is what it says. In the 7th year, the month of Kislevu, the king of Akkad, aka the king of Babylon, mustered his troops, marched to the Hatti land, and besieged the city of Judah. And on the 2nd day of the month of Adaru, he seized the city and captured the king. So there are 3 main points which I highlighted in this. First, he talks about the besiege of the city of Judah, or Jerusalem. Then he mentions that he captured the king, and he also states that he appointed a new king of his own choice. This event is described in the Bible in 2 Kings chapter 24. It says, "At that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against the city, as his servants were besieging it. Then Jehoiachin, king of Judah, his mother, his servants, his princes, and his officers went out to the king of Babylon, and the king of Babylon, in the 8th year of his reign, took him prisoner. Then the king of Babylon made Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, king in his place, and changed his name to Zedekiah." It's interesting that we see the same events mentioned. Nebuchadnezzar besieges the city, he captures King Jehoiachin and takes him as prisoner, and then he sets up a new king, Zedekiah, in his place. The next chapter, chapter 25, mentions another interesting event. "Now it came to pass in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, that Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, released Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a more prominent seat than those of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin changed from his prison garments, and he ate bread regularly before the king all the days of his life. And as for his provisions, there was a regular ration given him by the king, a portion for each day, all the days of his life." We've just read how Jehoiachin was taken prisoner to Babylon, but the Bible also mentions that he is eventually released, and he is given regular rations by the king all the days of his life. I really like the next artifact that was discovered during Robert Caldervey's excavations. It's this: Jehoiachin's ration tablet. The tablet lists deliveries of food and oil to important people, and one of the individuals it mentions, by name, is Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Not only is this extra biblical evidence for the historicity of the king, but it's also fascinating that it actually supports a very seemingly insignificant detail that's mentioned in the Bible, that Jehoiachin was given daily rations of food by the king. Now, I hope you still remember Tel Lachish. As I mentioned last week, it was invaded by King Sennacherib of Assyria, and it was destroyed. But it was later rebuilt and occupied by the Israelites again. Unfortunately, though, it was then destroyed again by the Babylonians. This is a picture I took when I was there of the gate, and it was here, inside the gate, that some artifacts were found called the Lachish letters. These were discovered during the first excavations of Lachish, and they're called ostrakon. Does anyone know what ostrakon are? No? Okay, so ostrakon, or ostraka in plural, were fragments of pottery, which people would write on either with ink or by inscribing the clay. So they found a number of these pottery sherds with writing on inside the gate, and they were written just before the Babylonian invasion. There's one letter which I think is particularly interesting. It's letter 4. May Yahweh cause my Lord to hear this very day tidings of good. And now, according to everything which my Lord has sent, this has your servant done. I wrote on the sheet according to everything which you sent to me, and inasmuch as my Lord sent to me concerning the matter of Bet Haraped, there is no one there. And as for Semayahu took him and brought him up to the city, and your servant is not sending him there any more. But when morning comes round, and may my Lord be apprised that we are watching for the fire signals of Lachish, according to all the signs which my Lord has given, because we cannot see EZRA. It's interesting that at the end of this letter, it states that the fire signals of the city of EZRA could not be seen. And it would be reasonable to wonder why. Why could they not see the fire signals? And one very possible explanation is because the city of EZRA may already have been destroyed by the Babylonians. The book of Jeremiah makes this statement. Then Jeremiah the prophet spoke all these words to Zedekiah, king of Judah in Jerusalem, when the king of Babylon's army fought against Jerusalem, and all the cities of Judah that were left, against Lachish and EZRA, for only these fortified cities remained of the cities of Judah. Lachish and EZRA were two of the last cities to remain before the destruction of Jerusalem. This Lachish letter really provides some of the dying words of Judah as they try to survive the onslaught of Babylon. And it's quite sad when you think about it, that these people are writing these letters literally just before the city is going to be destroyed. And yet the Bible makes it clear that God time and time again was sending prophets to the nation, to Israel, to try and get them to repent, because he didn't want this to happen. He didn't want Israel to be destroyed. But because they refused to listen to the many warnings, we know what happened to Israel in the end. The cities of Lachish and EZRA fell, and in January 587 BC, Nebuchadnezzar began his siege on Jerusalem. Babylon was indeed a mighty empire. But as amazing as it was, it didn't last forever, did it? No. Because we learned that eventually Cyrus invaded Babylon. This object is called the Cyrus cylinder. Does anyone want to guess which museum it's found in? Yes, it is currently in the British Museum. It was discovered in 1879, and it records the Persian king capturing the city of Babylon in October 539. It also mentions how Cyrus allowed some people who had been displaced to return to their homelands. Though it doesn't specifically mention the Jewish exiles, it does fit with Cyrus's decree mentioned in Ezra chapter 1. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, "All the kingdoms of the earth the Lord God has given me, and he has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is among you of all his people? May his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel." Ancient Babylon did not last forever, but the Bible actually predicted this hundreds of years earlier. The prophet Isaiah states this: "And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, The beauty of the Chaldeans' pride will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited, nor will it be settled from generation to generation. Isaiah even predicts who would take over the kingdom of Babylon. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him and loose the armour of kings, to open before him the double doors, so that the gates will not be shut. These predictions would have sounded crazy. I mean, we've just seen how magnificent and how extensive and fortified Babylon was. 250 fortified towers, walls thick enough to ride chariots, the river Euphrates running right through. They would have had enough food to have survived a siege that lasted 20 years. It seemed impossible that Babylon would ever fall. But yet these seemingly ridiculous-sounding prophecies recorded in Isaiah came to pass. Herodotus talks about how Cyrus diverted the course of the river and how his army were able to walk underneath the walls and defeat the city in one night. Isaiah prophesied that Babylon would end up as a city that would never again be inhabited. It would never be rebuilt. In the 1980s, a modern ruler called Saddam Hussein was in power. Saddam Hussein revered Nebuchadnezzar. He looked up to him, and he wanted to model himself on this Babylonian king. And so he attempted to rebuild and restore the ancient city. He even created some modern mud bricks, which he stamped with his own name and added to his construction. But Isaiah said it would never be rebuilt or inhabited, and he was right, because Saddam Hussein's building project was stopped by the Gulf War. He wasn't able to finish his work on restoring Babylon. If you go there now, it's largely destroyed, and no one is living there. In fact, it was used for a period of time as an American military base, and during that time, a lot of damage was done to the city. The once majestic city of Babylon today is little more than ruins. But it's a reminder that even when the Bible declares that certain things will happen that we might think is impossible, that ultimately God knows what he's talking about. He knows the future, and so we can trust that whatever trouble we go through, whether it's in the realms of world kingdoms and politics, or whether it's just in situations in our own lives, God is still in control. Thank you for listening.